I'll dive right in. Brief overview. I'll give you a little bit of context. I'll talk about how the Australian regulation works. I'll talk about genome editing and what the issue is with regulation. And then I'll talk about our approach to regulation of genome editing as it currently sits. I like to use this slide as a segue to presentations. So this journey, I think, begins back in 1975 with the meeting of scientists at Asilomar when recombinant DNA was kicking off, and they took a very precautionary approach. And then the history what we're talking about is set by the history around 2000. Just get the laser pointer on. Most countries, and Martin referred to the Cartagena Protocol, so around 2000 we have GMO-specific laws and definitions. Then we move through new plant breeding technologies, which has morphed into being called genome editing. And as Jennifer spoke about, we have CRISPR. And perhaps to note, part of the issue is we have the European Court of Justice ruling. Okay, the concepts for recombinant DNA laws at about 2000 were that we had a new technology, that precautionary approach was still there, felt there was a need for pre-market assessments, but that traditional breeding technologies like mutagenesis might be excluded. So there are basically three approaches taken. GMO-specific laws, most countries in the world have done that. A novelty trigger, Canada and New Zealand are the two countries that I think are the preeminent examples of that, or to adapt existing laws without GMO-specific clauses. And I think the USA is the best example of that. So Australian laws for GMOs, GM food, and that relate to the discussion about genome editing. We have legal definitions sitting in the Gene Technology Act for GMOs and in the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code with a process trigger, a definitional if gene technology was used, and then there's a science-based case-by-case assessment and approval pathway. I'll just show you briefly the definition for the food situation. Just you'll see that recombinant DNA features in that definition, and that the food is taken from an organism that was modified by gene technology. So I'm not from the food regulator, so I won't speak in any detail about their side of things. But I am from the GMO regulator, so we have a broad definition, an organism modified by gene technology with some exclusions, and we have a broad definition of gene technology, very broad, any technique, but with the keeping out of sexual reproduction and also with the potential for techniques to be declared. And that's done in another piece of legislation called the regulations. In terms of those exclusions, there's a schedule for techniques that aren't gene technology. I won't read them all off. Basically, they exclude conventional mutagenesis techniques. And I'll come back to these other two schedules in a little while. Schedule 1, organisms that aren't GMOs or are not GMOs. Schedule 1B, quite a new one, specific definitions for organisms that are GMOs. And the regulations, as opposed to the higher level act, subject to fairly regular technical reviews. So the problem, back in about 2000, everyone had their different definitions, and your classical transgenic, those definitions would say that's a GMO. We fast forward to 2021, all of these new techniques, different definitions, and the question then arises, are those things still GMOs? So classically, 2000, you get the same regulatory outcome. In 2021, you've got different definitions, that may result in different regulatory outcomes. And so, for example, you may have asymmetry where the GMO in country A is not considered a GMO in country B because of those definitions. So you've got uncertainty, and even uncertainty in the wording of definitions, which was the case in our legislation. I'll keep moving along. In terms of the response to genome editing, I'll just say that in the food space, our colleagues have been looking at this, and they have a review underway. I expect that you'll see something in this calendar year, but I won't dwell on that if you can look at their website for information. In the GMO realm of things, we did a review in 2017-18 and made some changes in 2019, which clarified the regulation around SDN1 and SDN2 in particular. There's also a policy review and its outcomes which are still ongoing. There was a reference in the review report to looking at definitions. Once again, I anticipate that you will see something about that in the coming months, but I won't say any more about that. That's a big P policy issue, if you like, not within the remit of the regulator. Too many fly-ins, sorry. Okay, so in this slide, if you concentrate on that dotted line, this is the outcome of the review and some of the rationale for it. The things that are red below the line are regulated as GMOs, and the things above the line, not GMOs. So you have the conventional techniques, and the review excluded SDN1 techniques where there was no template added. And so you have the SDN1 outcomes are very similar to those small nucleotide changes from conventional techniques. And if you look at that in terms of the regulatory wording, Schedule 1, and there are other items in these schedules, but for genome editing, organisms that are not GMOs, if it's an SDN1 modification and there was no nucleic acid template that was added to guide homology-directed repair. Mirroring that, also introduced in 2019, if oligo-directed mutagenesis was used, so you've got the introduction of some nucleic acid to direct the change, that is a GMO. And even if you use a site-directed nuclease, but you add a nucleic acid template to guide that repair to make the change, that is also captured as a GMO. I think I've maybe gone faster than I thought. One of the take-home messages I want to leave people with, particularly the scientists in the audience, is that it's the legal definitions that matter in the regulatory space. There are lots of terms of art about what genome editing is, what an SDN is, what SDN1 versus SDN2. And this is an example of a paper which incorrectly said that if no foreign nucleic acid was added, then it was not subject to regulation. However, as I've described, some genome edited crops are not regulated as GMOs in Australia, but some of them are. And so I'll stop there if anyone has any questions.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I know that you're one of the people that has additional material in your presentation which we can share with others afterwards.